So hello everyone, welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. I am Kelsey O'Connor, I'm one of the organizers. We also have Chiara Peroni and Francesco Saracino online. Today we are pleased to have Dr. Caspar Kaiser speak about how the scientific value of numerical measures of human feelings. The scientific value of numerical measures of human feelings. So Caspar will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end. At which time, please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on the website and on our YouTube channel. Also, you can see on our website our general schedule. This is the second to the last for this season. We have Emma Pleeging coming in a couple of weeks, and then some speakers set up for next spring set already. And on to introduce Dr. Caspar Kaiser. So Caspar is a research officer at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and a research fellow at the Wellbeing Research Center, both of which are part of the University of Oxford. He is a trustee of the Happier Lives Institute, which aims to find the most cost-effective ways to improve global well-being. And Caspar's research focuses primarily on the measurement and determinants of well-being. To this end, he works on improving the comparability of survey data on people's feelings and analyzes whether such data can measure welfare cardinally. And he investigates how social comparisons and inequalities shape well-being. He has an impressive set of publications, especially as a junior scholar, appearing in Nature and Human Behavior, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, European Sociological Review, and the journal in which today's research appears, the U.S. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Caspar Kaiser. Caspar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So this is joint work with Andrew Oswald, who is not from the University of Warwick, but from the University of Warwick. So that's embarrassing that the first slide has a typo. But so I'm going to talk about the scientific value of numerical measures of human feelings. Slightly grand title. A possibly less grand and more accurate title would have been Actions and Satisfactions, a validation exercise. But that's what it is. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So let's see if this works. So essentially, I make three key points in this presentation and as in the paper. And the first one is that a single integer of people reporting about their feelings or their satisfaction is better at predicting subsequent actions in a given domain than a combined set of sort of standard socioeconomic variables. My second point is that this relationship between these feelings integers and the corresponding behavior is pretty much monotonic. So when you move from a 1 to a 2, the probability of taking the action always moves in the same direction, no matter where you are currently on the scale. And this relationship is fairly close to linear, not perfectly linear, and fairly widely replicable across domains of life and across countries. And what these 3 points sort of jointly imply is that people seem to intuitively implement and can then actually report on a roughly cardinal scale of their own satisfaction with various aspects of their lives. And I think an important part here is the roughly cardinal bit of that sentence. We already knew sort of that people have some idea of how they can report on their feelings and can say whether they're better off or worse off. But it isn't entirely clear that this scale would in fact be cardinal. Okay, so why do this in the first place? So one primary reason why we felt compelled to do this kind of work is that often when submitting to higher ranking economics journals, we will at least get 1 or 2 reviewers who say, another one of these studies using subjective data. Don't they know that this is essentially fluff? We don't know what the subjective data means. It's entirely unclear. I can't interpret this data. And even if I could interpret it, it would definitely only be ordinal data, and we can't conclude anything on the basis of ordinal data. And I think part of that sentiment is a fairly old sentiment. I think Bertrand and Mullainathan I think it was a part of the American Economic Review, where they published that, did quite a bit of caused quite a bit of that sentiment. Now, of course, there's also some historical background to that type of belief within economics. But over the last sort of 3 years, 4 years, the fairly well-known paper by Bont and Lang, which I think technically is a very good paper, but for the field of or the set of people who are doing work on subjective data within economics or economics adjacent fields, has made this quite a lot harder, because now you often get the response of the form, these subjective data are at most ordinal, and when the data is ordinal, we can't do very much with it. And that's very much one reason why we're writing this paper and the background to which we're reacting. But I think another reason, at least for me personally, I continue to find it genuinely puzzling, the belief that if somebody is sort of prompted with a question, how satisfied are you with your job, say, that I then can, or that I'm supposedly able to just respond with some number, and that this number is in some way meaningful, that there would be some fairly definite meaning attached to a 7 out of 10. Like, where does this number come from? And why should I be confident in that number? And why should a listener be confident in that number? And I find that in general fairly puzzling, that this is supposedly working, even though I find myself in that field. So that's sort of the motivation and background. Now, here we're taking a slightly more narrow approach, where we're saying, okay, decision utility, which is a thing that is much talked about within economics, really is just a propensity for taking a certain action. So a revealed preference is nothing but taking the action of buying the apple rather than the orange, or having the propensity to taking the apple rather than the orange. So if it turns out that these data on reported satisfaction monotonically, so always in the same direction, predict actions within the same domain, then the claim that such data proxies decision utility seems to be a fairly strong one. And that's sort of the idea here. Of course, there's some related research that's been done before in that sort of area. So an early piece of work by Andrew Clark and others in 2001, I think it was in labor economics, they did have regressions, cross-sectional regressions, where they showed that for job satisfaction in particular, it was associated with future job quits. And we're essentially generalizing that idea to more data sets, to a panel setting, and to more domains. Another, I think, fairly well-known paper is by Dan Benjamin and others, where they essentially show that people stated anticipated satisfaction with, in that case, residency choices of young doctors is associated with the actual satisfaction, with the actual choices that these doctors then make in sort of in this sort of program where they have to like make their choices or rank their choices, and then they're allocated to different hospitals. And their anticipated reported satisfaction is very strongly correlated with the kinds of choices that they make in that program. And then there's a couple of other pieces along those sorts of lines where in general, sort of the idea that satisfaction data is associated with subsequent actions. There's also a different kind of literature on validating this kind of satisfaction data. So there's a fairly long list of work where people try to check how data on self-reported health is associated with future mortality. So that's, for example, summarized in that Idler and Beniamini paper. And then there's also some work sort of trying to establish associations in different variants of brain activity. I mean, Uri et al. is a well-known study in that sort of vein. What they do there is they show that several variants of life satisfaction data and eudaimonic data is associated with some asymmetry in the activation of the prefrontal cortex, and for some reason that is to be expected. I'm no neuroscientist, so I don't quite know why that is the case, but they take that to be evidence of validity of satisfaction data. There's also some other pieces. For example, Seda and Oishi show that people who smile, or who in Facebook pictures actually smile more often, have greater life satisfaction a couple of years down the line. And Oswald and Wu, they essentially estimate a compensating differentials model of different US states, and then show that these compensating differentials, so sort of amenities of different states, are strongly correlated with levels of well-being, self-reported well-being in these states. So there's other kinds of validity studies that sort of fall in that vein. But our approach, I think, is slightly more direct than that. And so essentially what we do is we take data on different kinds of domain satisfactions. So these are our feelings integers. Why integers? Well, because they're just scored from 0 to 10 typically, and they're not real. I mean, they don't exist on the full real number line. I mean, they're just integers, and they refer to feelings, so feelings integers. And we relate these feelings integers measured at some time point t-1 to a salient quitting behavior 1 year later, so at time t. So in the case of job satisfaction, where people answered a question about how satisfied are you with your job, we relate those to the probability of a job quit. In the case of partner satisfaction, we relate those to the probability of divorce or separation for those people that do have a partner. In the case of neighborhood satisfaction, we relate it to housing relocation. In the case of health satisfaction, and there it becomes slightly more difficult to claim directness, we relate it to hospital stay. But of course, oftentimes a hospital stay is not, that action isn't actually decided on by the patient, him or herself, but by a doctor. So in that sense, with the health satisfaction data, the claim that this is a direct connection between the feelings integer and the subsequent self-chosen action is not as clear. And then what we didn't do, and I think it is impossible to do because fortunately suicides happen very rarely, but if one wanted to validate life satisfaction data in that kind of style, then probably the corresponding behavior would be suicide. But given that suicides happen so rarely, this isn't really feasible. Though later on I will show some unpublished results that sort of go in that kind of direction. And so what's the advantage here? Well, if we interpret these satisfaction integers or feelings integers as measuring an internal representation of decision utility, then these satisfaction to action pairs seem to be much more direct than the kind of validation evidence that I've noted previously. Simply because here the domain satisfaction, what people say is just the thing that then people take actions over, right? And so that's more direct than in the other cases. Okay. So, and then we try to essentially answer two research questions. The first one, in my view, slightly less interesting one, is whether the probability of switching in one of these four domains better predicted by socioeconomic variables that would often be used in the literature, or by these integer satisfaction data. And the second research question is whether the probability of switching actually monotonically decreases in these integer satisfaction reports, and whether that relationship is linear. And the reason why I think it's important to look at whether that relationship is linear will become clear shortly. So maybe this will now seem slightly weird to you, but I suppose it's legitimate to ask why we should suppose these satisfaction data were actually to be genuine, which I believe, and which I believe this is also evidence in favor of. So why should we then expect these data to be associated with quit behavior? In some sense, it's perfectly obvious, right? I mean, yeah, of course, how I feel should be associated with my probability of quitting. But I think there's something helpful to have a simplified model to generate at least some intuitions that might be helpful. Okay, so let's just make a very simple model that's only in the supplementary material of the paper, if you want to reread that part of it. So suppose then that you're a person that's considering whether to stay at your current job with some utility U inside, or that you want to seek another job with some other utility U outside, where U outside will be larger than U inside. But in order to make that switch, you incur a cost. For example, a search cost, right? You're searching for this new job with utility U outside imposes some cost on you, some stress, filling out applications, searching for jobs, etc. Right? And now the probability of you actually making that switch, which we call P, is then a function of that cost. And we can imagine that a person sort of tries to pick her optimal P, like a rational utility maximizing agent. And then we can analyze what we should expect about the relationship between this probability P, which we can estimate, and that person's inside utility, which we have self-reports on. So suppose that a person's maximum then is just the probability of the utility outside of the status quo, so that's P U outside, plus 1 minus that probability U inside, minus this search cost. And when that agent then, tries to pick her optimal P, you differentiate this first equation, set it to 0, and then you get this second expression here. When you then differentiate both of these sides again with respect to U inside, you get this slightly mysterious initially looking expression. But now the interesting thing is that because we already know that because this is a rational agent, we are already at the maximum of this function V. And if you're at a maximum, the second derivative of that function will be negative. We already know that the second derivative of this function will be minus C double prime P. So we know here that C double prime P must be positive in order to make this entire second derivative negative. Okay, so we know that this thing, C double prime P, is positive. So what that means is that this thing, given that we have a minus here already, has to be negative. So we know that dpdu, so the derivative of the probability of switching with respect to your inside utility, has to be negative. So in plain words, what that means is that indeed, following our intuition or in line with our intuition, that greater satisfaction must reduce the probability of switching away from the status quo. Now, a fairly interesting or possibly interesting thing is, suppose that the cost function was quadratic, or could at least be reasonably well approximated by a quadratic function. Then if you were to take that second derivative, you would see that dpdu, so the change in the probability of switching as a function of your inside utility, will be a constant. And what that in turn means, and I think that's kind of interesting is that the graph of that function, of that probability of switching against the inside utility would then be linear. So in cases where this cost function can at least be approximated by a quadratic function, the picture graphing the probability of a quit against inside utility will be linear. And so that's what I'm going to look for in the pictures I'm going to show you later. I realize I raced sort of through that, but maybe we can chat about this if there's interest about that little toy model in the Q&A if need be. Let me just quickly talk about the data that we're using for the paper. So essentially we have 3 data sets, all of which are fairly standard and probably familiar to many of you. So the first one is the German socioeconomic panel. There in most cases, satisfaction is measured on this 0 to 10 integer scale. Only subjective health is measured on a shorter scale here. In the UK HLS, so that's a UK data set, satisfaction is measured on only a 1 to 7 scale. And in the Australian HILDA data set, again, we have satisfaction measured on 0 to 10. And you see that each of these data sets, they are panel data sets, they are nationally representative, and they cover fairly long periods of historical time. So that's quite nice because we essentially get very, very large samples. What isn't in the paper, but I'm going to show a little bit or one result on the basis of the share data set. So that's a data set of people aged 50 and above across a number of European countries, and their life satisfaction is measured on a 0 to 10 scale, and it'll become clear why I will show that data and result to you. Okay, and then in terms of the empirical approach, I suppose some of you will have already guessed how this is going to go. Essentially what we do is we estimate a bunch of OLS regressions, where on the left-hand side, it's just a dummy of quit IT plus 1, where if you take a quit, that dummy takes a 1. If you don't quit, the dummy is a 0. And so that's essentially just a linear probability model. And then we have a person's satisfaction entered either linearly, so just as a number, or as a series of dummies where we can then check for any non-linearities. And then the vector xit just includes a bunch of controls, some of which sometimes they are all included, sometimes they're not all included. But yeah, and they can be time varying or time invariant depending on the specification. We also did the whole thing again with pooled OLS regressions with and without controls, and we also estimated a bunch of logit models, and you pretty much always get the same result. Yeah, are there any? I should have probably said that clarification questions are very welcome. So, Kelsey, if you see any in the chat, just shout at me. If not, let me just get through research question 1, which is whether the probability of switching is better predicted by socioeconomic data or by these integer satisfaction data. And it turns out that across these countries and across domains, so with domain I always mean either housing, partner separation, jobs, or hospitalization, most of the time the single integer wins out against this bunch of socioeconomic variables. So let me unpack this. What we do here is we estimate a regression that only includes a single variable linearly entered. It's just a number of a person's either job satisfaction or partner satisfaction or health satisfaction or housing satisfaction, / neighborhood satisfaction. Plus, I should say, h squared, h cubed, and a bunch of wave dummies, because essentially age does quite a bit across the life course. As you can imagine, people in their 20s rarely divorce. And then we do the same thing, but now we are replacing the integer satisfaction data by a bunch of socioeconomic variables, which include the log of household income, a measure of relative income, which I can explain if there's need, whether you're self-employed, number of adults, number of children in the household, whether you're married, where it's relevant. So we don't include that in the partner separation regression, whether you just had a childbirth, employment status, firm size, education, and a bunch of state dummies to capture any regional variation, which isn't in the integer satisfaction models. And when we do that across domains, in most cases, the integer satisfaction yields the higher R squared. We do this a bunch of ways. So here I show the adjusted R squared values. If I were to, for example, only use the within R squared or the mean squared error or some other goodness of fit measures, like for example the AIC, the results are always the same. So it doesn't really depend on the kind of goodness of fit measure that we're using. The only cases where, perhaps in line with intuition, where the socioeconomic variables win out more often are in the cases of hospitalization. And in some sense that makes sense, because that's of the three, of the four domains we're looking at, the one where the persons have the least amount of agency. So that's maybe one way of looking at that. Okay, so that's essentially our answer to research question 1. So let's move on then to the second research question, which I think is anyways the more interesting one. Whether this probability of switching is actually monotonically decreasing in the integer satisfaction reports, and how nonlinear that relationship is. Because in my mind, the degree of nonlinearity informs us about the degree to which this data is cardinally interpretable. Okay, so I'm going to now show you 3 times essentially the same picture, starting with the UK dataset, so the UK household longitudinal survey. And what's essentially shown here are the results from individual fixed effects models, like the one that I've shown you before, with a bunch of controls listed at the bottom, where on the y-axis you see the predicted probability of quitting the status quo. So that's P in the toy model against the satisfaction reports measured in this case on this 1 to 7 integer scale. And what you see is, of course, the scale of it varies across domains. The probability, for example, of a hospital visit is just overall somewhat smaller than, for example, the probability of a job change. But in any case, what you do see is that this association is fairly well defined, which is, I mean, partly driven by the fact that we have a large sample. And it is, at least for a large part of the scale, linear. Of course, if you now look at the case of partnership dissolution, the jump from a 1 to a 2, and then also maybe the jump from a 2 to a 3 is clearly steeper than the rest of the scale. But afterwards, it becomes, again, fairly linear. I think that the most striking version of that is in the case of the job change, where this association is just straightforwardly linear. So the probability, the change in the probability of you quitting your job always declines by the same amount as you become more satisfied with your job, in line with the kind of prediction of our toy model I've shown you earlier. Okay. When we do the same thing, again, for Germany, we see roughly the same thing. Again, we see sort of quite a bit more curvature in the case of partnership dissolution. And we see sort of a slight non-monotonicity in the case of changing dwellings, where where the probability of quitting actually doesn't really change when you move from a 1 to a 2. I should say that for the German data set, we only observe whether a person moves for household heads. So in that sense, it's a slightly unusual and smaller sample. But yeah, that's what it is. Moving on, going to Australia, the lines start to become slightly more wonky, but for the largest part of the distribution of responses, which I suppose some of you will know, are largely concentrated somewhere between the 5s and the 9s. We again get a well-defined association that is roughly linear in the parts of at least in the parts of the distribution where most of the answers lie, but pretty much also in the rest. So of course, you again see some non-monotonicity, for example, in the case of change of dwelling, where there's actually an increase in the probability moving from a 0 to a 1, but very, very few people actually made use of these responses. So there's quite a bit of noise there. Okay. So that's the summary. That's really all I have to show for research question 2, which is that these satisfaction integers predict actions near monotonically, not perfectly, but very close to monotonically. That this relationship is generally convex, but reasonably close to linear. And it's fairly widely replicable. We always get roughly the same thing across these fairly different domains of lives and across these 3 different countries. But I guess some of you, at least I count myself as one such person, I'm less interested in domain-specific satisfaction. I'm less interested in housing satisfaction or job satisfaction than I'm interested in life satisfaction, because I think in some way life satisfaction might be a fairly good proxy of overall utility or of overall how well people's lives are. Though that's contestable and in part, I think, a debate for philosophers, but at least I have some good reasons to believe that life satisfaction is a fairly good stab at conceptually at a proxy for overall utility. So to me, it would be most important to have a validation of that sort for life satisfaction. So suicide data, fortunately, doesn't exist to do the same sort of thing. But what the European share data set does have is probably the closest substitute for it. And that is, they asked essentially most parts of the sample, which remember are people above the age of 50, whether they had any suicidal thoughts, I believe, in the last month. And so sort of in extending the kind of approach I've shown earlier, but this isn't in the paper, we can do the same sort of thing again and just plot the probability of having these kinds of suicidal thoughts with people's reported life satisfaction. So these aren't, of course, genuine actions, but they are at least indicative for pondering such an action. And again, what we see is we again see this sort of convexity with linearity in a large part of the scale. So also for life satisfaction, it seems like that we are not crazy far off from a cardinal measure that as would be predicted in the toy model that I've shown you earlier. So I'm not sure whether to pursue this further, but I just thought to share this in this presentation to see what people think of whether they find that persuasive or not. Okay, maybe just one final thought. So why again does this linearity matter? So one way of thinking about this is this. So our model predicts, at least if you think, okay, this cost function should be roughly quadratic, then our model predicts that the probability of quitting should be linear in the latent satisfaction, the unobserved satisfaction. We only observe the reported level of satisfaction. And then we observe some departures from linearity, right? So what we can then do, if we take our model as the correct model, we can adjust based on what we observe in the data. We can adjust the original data to make then linearity true. So, for example, what I show here is actually how one would adjust the job satisfaction data in the UK data set based on the result I've shown you earlier. So what we see here is, right, that it's slightly steeper here from the 1 to the 2 than it is from the 3 to the 4, but then from the 4 to the 5 it again becomes steeper. And what we can then do is to say, okay, what that means is that the jump from a 2 to a 3 on the original scale in terms of the latent unobserved scale should be somewhat smaller than the jump from a 4 to a 5, where the probability of quitting increases by a larger amount. So in that sense, we can adjust our original data to correspond to the postulated model, and then check whether, for example, in some other model where we take job satisfaction, say, to be the dependent variable, whether our results substantially change. So that's one way of thinking about why I take linearity to be really rather important in these kinds of results that I've shown you. Okay, so let me conclude. So first point, it seems that this satisfaction data is better at predicting subsequent actions than sort of standard socioeconomic variables. Second, these satisfaction integers predict actions near monotonically. A jump from a 1 to a 2 decreases your probability of quitting, and a jump from a 7 to an 8 also decreases your probability of quitting the status quo. These satisfaction integers and actions tend to have a convex relationship, but that is fairly close to linear. And I hope I've explained to you why I think linearity or approximate linearity is relatively important. And the final point is that this relationship is fairly widely replicable. There seems to be something universal about it. There's a couple of next steps that one might take. So I'm sort of pondering whether this data on suicidal thoughts or data on suicides would be a good validation sort of test of the life satisfaction data that many of us are most interested in. Another, I suppose, interesting avenue would be to check in again, trying to get panel data, whether the relationships that I've shown you here also exist more widely and specifically in low and middle income countries, where the literature is increasingly also using subjective data, but where the validation evidence is much slimmer than it is for richer countries. And finally, you might be able to use this kind of approach to get at differences between people and how they use their scales. So suppose that the action to satisfaction relationship or reported satisfaction relationship were quite a lot different between genders. Then you might make the argument that this is indicative of different men and women using the scales in a different way. So I've done some initial results where that difference wasn't all that large, and I'm currently toying with the idea of maybe pursuing that sort of heterogeneity analysis further. That's it from my side. I hope I didn't go over time too much, and looking forward to any comments, thoughts, questions, etc. Thank you, and thank you, Kelsey, for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Caspar. That's very interesting, important work for us as a field. So we have a few people who have raised their hands, so I'll go ahead and start just right off the top. Giovanni Burrow, if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And given we have a lot of people in the chat, if everyone could try to keep their questions, also the answer kind of short, Caspar will try to get to everybody. Thank you.
Sure. Should I stop sharing?
Why don't you stop sharing? But we may go back to a particular slide, but it
Sure.
should be fine. Yeah. So Giovanni, you're up first. Oh, we can't hear you. Looks like you're unmuted, but I still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this is great. I have two quick questions. So first of all, you have that people who score 1 on life satisfaction, they have probability of suicide of 50%. So basically, half of them commit suicide pretty soon. And the confidence band is pretty small. Okay, so it's not like that. And second, maybe you mentioned it, I missed a couple of parts. Is there the possibility to substitute suicide with other type of behaviors like addictions? Like I score low life satisfaction, then I'm more likely to enter drugs, alcohol addiction, this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So let me just quickly share this again. No, this is not the thing I wanted to share. One second. But I mean, I can also respond to it quickly without slides. It's true that these probabilities are very, very high and worryingly high, and it's indicative of quite a lot of misery associated with saying, oh, I'm a 0 out of 10 or 1 out of 10 on a life satisfaction scale. But fortunately, the rate at which people convert a suicidal ideation into an actual suicide attempt is fairly small. And then the rate at which then suicide attempts get converted into suicides is again fairly small. And so we shouldn't read this as people who score a 0 out of 10 on a life satisfaction scale have a 50% chance of dying of suicide in the next year. That would be an overstatement. I believe the rate. No, I don't know the number by heart, and I shouldn't say it. But yeah. Yeah, and then your second question, just quickly. Yeah, that's definitely possible. I just thought that in the kind of framework that we had set up there, dying of suicide is the closest match, right? It's the action that corresponds to life satisfaction in the same way a job quit corresponds to job satisfaction, as dire, I think, as that sounds.
Great, thank you. Next one was Anthony.
Yes, can you hear me, Caspar?
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks for the presentation. I mean, I like the paper already before the presentation, so it doesn't come as a surprise. But no, I have one comment and one question about suicide. You know that actually in Hilda, if you leave the panel and if you die in Hilda, actually, I think your closed ones are asked whether, like, you know, the condition of the death. So very likely you will have 0.5% of the people reporting a suicide, but might not be out of reach. Maybe with time, maybe we'll have more data on this matter. Now, like my real question is more about something you probably did on your second research question, which I think is the most important. When you compare, you know, did you think about comparing the R squared of the parametric and the non-parametric versions, and then use this, I think, as a tool for communication? I think this is like that would be like amazing. You know, you say like the adjusted R squared are exactly the same in the two specification, and that's it. That's the end of the game.
Yeah. Quick responses. I tried to use the actual observed suicide data in the share. If I didn't do something completely wrong, there are only 12 suicides in the entire share data set, and so it just doesn't work.
And check Hilda. Also Hilda, I think it's there too.
In Hilda.
In
okay.
Hilda, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
it's only under the assumption that there is still someone living in the household and then reporting the cause of the death.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I will try that. Thank you. On the second one, it's in the supplementary material, and essentially the R squared changes little. And it changes little when you compare a linear specification against a completely non-parametric specification, which I take to be evidence in favor of linearity in the parts of the scale where where most people find themselves in.
All right, great, Caspar. So right now, okay, Francesco's got the next question, and I'll let him go first, and I'll follow up as we proceed. Go ahead, Francesco.
No, great. Thanks, Caspar. That's very interesting. I have a clarification to ask you. Basically, if I get your results correctly, the main take-home message that I would derive is that when we use standard OLS regression methods, we basically don't make huge mistakes with this kind of data. The second message that, so I would like to know if you agree with this conclusion from your study. The second consideration has to do instead with the critique by Bond and Lang. So as far as I can tell from these results, I don't think you're saying anything concerning the interpersonal comparability of this kind of scales. Am I making a mistake? Thank you.
Francesco, at least in this domain, you're not making any mistakes. To unpack this. So I mean, it depends, of course, if you buy the assumption of this model that we set up and whether you find it intuitively plausible that the association between taking an action and the latent satisfaction is roughly linear. But if you buy that sort of assumption, then the results we show should update you towards thinking that coding life satisfaction data in their rank order, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, is the right thing to do. Now, you might want to be slightly more sophisticated about that and see and try out whether, a slightly sort of concave function, so transforming your life satisfaction data by a slightly concave function to capture the fact that, it seems like the difference between a 9 and a 10 isn't that large with respect to taking an action, and then see whether your results change. But I mean, this is then sort of a second order concern, I think. But by and large, it seems like the common practice of how we use OLS regressions seems to be roughly right. And I think that's really good news. And it could just have turned out otherwise, right? So that's nice. So you're right that Bond and Lang talk about this ordinality issue, but then they also sort of sneak in this problem of interpersonal comparability. And we say nothing about that, right? In that paper, we say nothing about interpersonal comparability. But what I said at the very end, you could conceivably use this kind of approach to check, is the action to satisfaction relationship the same across socioeconomic groups, and with that try to get at the interpersonal comparability. So if I can just share something that I made some time ago but then didn't use for the paper, is this. I don't know if you can see the picture that I'm showing here.
I see.
Yes.
So that's an older version of the data, but there I just distinguished between men and women in the association between actions and satisfaction. And what I thought was fairly striking here was that the association is very, very similar across the two genders, which you might want to read as evidence of at least approximate comparability between genders. And you could, of course, generalize this to other socioeconomic variables. So that's one thing that one might do, and using this get to comparability between people. But so far, it's just a thought rather than a paper.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with your last remark, because when you're looking into these aggregates, you might still thinking that there might be within group heterogeneity, and then opposite signs just compensate each other. But yeah, it's suggestive. Thank you.
All right, Caspar. So I don't see any other questions at present. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you one it's a little bit more provocative. So if you look at your R squareds altogether, they're, let's say approximately a 0.2 is among your higher ones. And I wonder, if you have maybe thought about models of, say, job quits or hospitalizations more broadly that use a different set of predictors. So there's a kind of a couple of questions in here. Why do we think that the socioeconomic variables that you had were the best predictors initially? And, and what would we see from, let's say, models of job quits coming from, I don't know, I guess the labor literature, and what kind of R-squareds are they getting? So I wanted to know, how are we doing overall? Because really the baseline here is a comparison between the subjective data and socioeconomic variables that you've kind of selected. And maybe we're missing the point, and there should be something else here to get at a better prediction of the behavior.
Yeah. Okay, so that's I can make an even worse version of that, I suppose, is that these were adjusted R-squareds, right? But I think it's in the supplementary material, if you go and look at just the within R-squared, we're again dropping by quite a bit. I think then we're at R-squared like 0.05 or so. So, and that's true for the objective variables, and it's for the satisfaction variables. So that means that in some sense, when we're only looking at within variations, so deviations from an overall probability, then we're extremely terrible. So there's two different ways of reading this. The first way of reading this is that just as social science, whether we're doing sort of work on using subjective data or whether we're doing work on objective data, we're just doing fairly badly. Like it might just be that as a science we're just not all that mature, and we're just not very good at predicting human behavior, or at least behavior in Germany, the UK, and Australia. So that's one possible take, that should then just tell us to do better in the future. The other possible take is to say the objective variables that Andrew and I that we've selected just weren't very good, right? Mm-hmm. And to that I respond then, okay, but what would be a good set of variables that would do much better? Like what's the sort of objective variables that we should enter that we could imagine doing better? So we didn't do sort of a systematic search. We took the kinds of variables that seemed sensible to us, and that's definitely a weakness of the paper. But if we were to be systematic about it, or trying to be more systematic about it, what would you suggest?
It's a good question. I mean, I would go to each individual literature, I think. So partner dissolution, there's going to be people who are writing about that, and they'll have, my guess is actually a collection, because they're not economists, they'll have a collection of subjective and objective variables included. And maybe they're getting R-squareds that are much higher, although they're probably not doing the panel studies within, So you're going exactly where I'm thinking, though. So this is, I think you're answering exactly. And so I don't have a better answer than you do. If it is, in fact, that we have such low R-squareds, should policymakers care, about these data, and I think your answer is right. That, how else are we going to do it? This is the best we have so far. If you go and look at the literature, though, I think it helps if you look at partner dissolution as an example, and see how well they're doing.
Yeah. Now, so I think what would be a good paper to write, and I think that would be a fun paper to write, is to go back to the table 1 type results and just try to beat it and try to make the objective variables win somehow, and see how good we can ultimately do. I think that's a good idea. Now I think I find myself in this slightly fairly small area of the social sciences that only looks at the subjective data. I don't know how good we are in general at predicting stuff, but I would be surprised if individual behavior in observational data were generally much better predicted in a longitudinal setting than is the case here. Possibly in sort of the genetics literature, but even then, I mean, then you get like people say heritability of like 0.3. I don't know what sort of R squared that should be converted to, but it doesn't seem like, you know, as part of the social sciences that we're particularly terrible.
Yeah, this makes sense. It's just you have to be careful. So, you know, typically the validation exercise is to look at the correlation, right, between two different measures, right? And so if you're, in this case, the outcome is the variable you're using to validate, and your correlation is probably pretty low, you know, then it would suggest that, you know, you're not actually valid if you don't have a good, you know, correlation statistic. However, those standards are subjective themselves, right? They're based on historical standards, and maybe they should be using a different standard to assess your study. But I think you're right, and I'm taking up too much time. We're approaching the end, however, so if please chime in if somebody has a question. You can write in the chat or raise your hand. Caspar, actually, then nobody's right. Oh, here we go. Alan's got a question. Alan, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Great. It's just more of a curiosity, really. I find the suicide stuff interesting, but yeah, I guess the ultimate reveal preference for sadness, really. On your graph, maybe I saw it wrong, but so even people who give their life satisfaction 8, 9, 10, there is some association, even if it's very small, with suicidal ideation.
Yep.
It really surprises me. Yeah, it really surprises me that people who can say their life satisfaction is 9, 10, there is some link for some of those people with suicide ideation. I don't know enough about the suicide literature to see if that makes sense or not, but it seems strange.
Let me just share this again, and then we can like ponder it together. So one reason why I'm didn't pursue this further is because I'm also not in that literature.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely sure what's standard here. Now, okay, so the top people here, the 8, 9s, and the 10s, where there's anyways almost no change between the steps. I mean, these 5% that we see here, this might be noise, right? This might be like people who selected 8, 9s, and 10s, but didn't actually intend to select one of those numbers. Or it might be people who selected, yes, I do have suicidal thoughts without having intended that.
Yeah.
So it seems to me possible. I mean, you wouldn't expect it to be precisely 0, right?
I think you're right, though. Some kind of measurement error, some kind of thing might explain a lot of that. Yeah.
Not sure how large the measurement error would have to be in order to be able to explain these people at the bottom here, but that's one possible explanation.
Yeah.
But then again, I don't know. It seems plausible for at least some people, to say, okay, I'm fairly satisfied with my life, and yet I sometimes have suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, I was wondering about the duration. So it's the duration of have you had suicidal thoughts? Is that duration, when it's asked about, a different period of time or a longer period of time than life satisfaction?
Right. So I think the life satisfaction question in the shared data set doesn't specify a time period, but the suicide question specifies last month. So it might be, right, that you're now feeling quite satisfied with your life. But 2 weeks ago, you had some suicidal thoughts.
Those issues, you kind of resolved to some extent that they don't exist anymore, and you feel happy about that. Yeah. It could even be a reaction from moving away from those ideation feelings as well, that meant suddenly happy. Suddenly very happy because you don't feel that way anymore, for some people. Yeah, it's interesting.
So, Caspar, if you don't mind staying a little bit longer, we have a question from Talita Grayling.
Sure.
Great. later.
Caspar, it's excellent to see you. But the explanation of the graph that you just showed is people with manic depression because they go into swings where they are so happy and swings where they are so depressed. So I think that's a plausible explanation.
Go ahead, Caspar.
Oh, that just seems right to me. I mean, some subset of this might be a variant of this. It might not even have to be clinical, right? So I suppose we only want to say manic depression in a clinical sort of sense, but there might be milder version of that sort of thought pattern that could explain the kind of data, right? I also see there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, actually, so it's Maxime. Is it easier for you to, or Caspar, maybe you can read it out? Just because if you don't read it, it doesn't get into the recording.
Sorry.
Oh, here's Maxime. Go ahead.
Hello. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Sorry, I joined late, so I was a little bit ashamed to disturb the discussion. So this is why I posted it on the chat. But my question was, and tell me if maybe I missed this part of the presentation. At some point, here I focus more on the first part. You basically your results tells us that specifications based on the this sentiment variable, so the satisfaction variable, perform better in terms of prediction than specification based on socioeconomic observed variables. And I wonder in which measure it could be due. So first I wondered if you used other type of models than simple linear models. Because I wonder if it was not due maybe to the fact that to map the observed variable to the individual decision, you have some kind of transformation layer. And maybe the idea is that the mapping function is not the appropriate one, in the sense that the observed economic conditions are transformed into individual perception through a more complex function. I don't know if I'm clear here.
So the short answer is no, we didn't try that. So I suppose one way of checking this would be, suppose you redid that table of the paper, but now instead of running an OLS regression, you run, I don't know, a gradient boosting machine or
exactly,
a random forest or something like this.
Like that, yeah.
And then you just check the predictive capacity of either model, right? Because then you would allow for some sort of weird non-additive effects, greater non-linearities in the individual terms, and so on.
Exactly.
That seemed like overkill to us in the paper, but that's fair enough. What I would wonder then, though, is okay. So because you wouldn't expect much performance gain in the satisfaction data set, because there are just no interactions to be captured, because it's just a single variable, right?
Exactly.
And capture interactions in the when you have multiple socioeconomic variables. So in that sense, a more sophisticated model would favor the socioeconomic specification.
That's what I would expect, because somehow if you use the perception of the individual, the mapping has already been made. So here it will be to give more chance to the specification with observed socioeconomic variables to give more chance, in the sense that to capture better this mapping that has already been done by the individual when you look at the satisfaction variable. Yeah. But apart from that, I mean, it's amazing to see how it performs, of course, but that would be maybe a nice robustness test. I don't know.
My guess is that my experience with fancy non-linear, non-additive models was that, at least in social science data, they don't do much better. So that would have been my intuition, but
okay.
That's
Thanks.
Good, thanks, guys. So looking like time to close. I have one just tiny question, Caspar. Am I fair to say that your results imply that, especially the linearity, that, the satisfaction variables imply cardinal decision utility? Is that fair to say?
They don't imply it, but I would say the results should update you towards believing in them.
Okay. All right. I think it looks like we're a little over time. Thank you everyone for staying. Thank you, Caspar, for the great presentation. Nice question and answer session. We will be posting this online fairly soon, and we hope to see you back in a couple of weeks for our next seminar. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks for all the questions, and thanks, Kelsey.
It was great seeing you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Talk soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Caspar. Bye.
Thank you, Chiara, for